My mother refused to walk me down the aisle because it would disrespect my stepfather. 2 weeks before my wedding, I was sitting in my childhood bedroom looking at old photo albums when my mother knocked on the door. I'd come over to pick up my grandmother's pearl necklace that I wanted to wear at my wedding. She sat down on the edge of my bed and told me she needed to talk to me about something important. I figured she was going to get emotional about her little girl getting married. Instead, she told me that she wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. She explained that my stepfather Roland felt it would be inappropriate for her to walk me when she'd already walked his daughter Marin down the aisle 3 years earlier. I asked her how that made any sense. She said that Roland believed it would look like she was playing favorites if she did the same thing for me that she did for Marin. I reminded her that I was her actual biological daughter and that Marin was her stepdaughter of 8 years. She said that biology didn't determine family and that I needed to be more considerate of Roland's feelings. I asked her whose idea this really was. She admitted that Roland had brought it up, but that she agreed with his logic. I sat there trying to understand what I was hearing. My mother had walked a man's daughter from his first marriage down the aisle at her wedding, but refused to do the same for her own flesh and blood because it might upset that same man. I asked her if she understood how backwards that sounded. She told me I was being selfish and that marriage was about compromise. I said I wasn't married to Roland, so I didn't need to compromise with him. She said that comment was exactly the kind of attitude that made Roland feel unwelcome in our family. I wanted to scream that Roland had made me feel unwelcome in my own family for the past 8 years, but I knew it wouldn't matter. My mother had chosen her side a long time ago. She kept talking the way she always did, when she'd already decided something and just needed me to absorb it. She said she'd thought about this for a long time. She said Roland had been hurt by the way I treated him at family dinners, distant and cold, and that this was a chance to show him I respected the family we'd become. I asked her what family she was talking about, because the only family I remembered was the one before Roland when it was just the two of us learning how to survive after my father died. She flinched when I said that. For a second, I thought I'd reached her. Then her face went smooth again, and she said that my father had been gone for over a decade and that I couldn't keep using his memory as a weapon. I told her I wasn't using anything as a weapon. I was just trying to understand how a mother could walk a stranger's daughter down the aisle and refuse her own. She stood up and smoothed the front of her blouse and said she'd hoped I would be more mature about this. I asked her if Roland had even watched her practice the walk with Marin, the way fathers practice with daughters in the weeks before a wedding. She didn't answer. She'd practiced. I could see it on her face. She'd walked the steps with Marin in some hallway somewhere, counting under her breath, making sure she got it right for a girl who wasn't hers, while her own daughter sat across town, not even knowing the conversation was coming. I looked down at the photo album still open on my lap. There was a picture of me at 6, gap-toothed and sunburned, sitting on my father's shoulders at a county fair. My mother was beside us in the photo, younger and laughing, her hand resting on my father's arm. I remembered when that woman would have torn the world apart for me. I didn't know where she'd gone. I asked her one more time quietly if she was sure. I gave her the easiest possible out. I said that if she walked it back right now, if she just said she'd made a mistake, I would forget the whole conversation ever happened, and we'd never speak of it again. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said that Roland was her husband and that I needed to start acting like an adult. That was her answer. I closed the album. I picked up the small velvet box with my grandmother's pearls inside, the pearls that had come down through my father's side of the family, not hers. I stood up and walked past her to the door. She said my name once, the way she used to when I was a child and had disappointed her over something small. I didn't turn around. I took my grandmother's pearls and left without saying goodbye. When I got home, I told my fiancé, Elias, what happened. He was furious on my behalf and offered to talk to my mother, adult to adult. I told him not to bother because my mother's mind was made up. Elias asked who I wanted to walk me down the aisle instead. I said I'd walk myself before I gave my mother the satisfaction of seeing me beg. He didn't push it. He just sat down next to me on the couch and pulled me into his side and let me be quiet for a while. After a few minutes, he said the thing I needed to hear, which was that I wasn't crazy, that what she'd done was as bad as it sounded, that he'd been there the whole 8 years and he'd watched it happen in slow motion. He reminded me of the Thanksgiving 2 years ago, when Roland had stood up to give a toast and thanked everyone at the table by name except me, and how my mother had just sat there refilling his wine. He reminded me of the birthday dinner where Roland had ordered for the whole table and forgotten my plate, and how my mother had told me later that I was being sensitive when I mentioned it. He had a list. It turned out he'd been keeping it the way you keep evidence. I hadn't known that. It made me cry, but the good kind. The kind where someone finally says out loud, the thing you've been carrying alone. The next 2 weeks were torture. Roland called me 3 times to explain that he hoped I understood his position and that he really did see me as family. I didn't answer. Marin texted me saying she'd heard what happened and that she thought her dad was being ridiculous, but that she didn't want to get involved. I didn't respond to her either. My mother sent me an email that was clearly written by Roland, saying that she loved me and that she hoped I would come to see this as an opportunity to show my independence as a modern woman. I deleted it without finishing. The phrasing alone gave it away. My mother had never once in her life used the words modern woman. She said things like, be reasonable and don't make a scene. The email read like a man trying to sound like a woman who was trying to sound reasonable, and the whole thing made my skin crawl. Elias read it over my shoulder and said the same thing I was thinking, which was that Roland couldn't even let her apologize in her own voice. He had to script it. He had to make sure that even the olive branch carried his fingerprints. I should explain about Roland because it matters for everything that came after. He came into our lives when I was 16, a tall, soft-spoken man who sold commercial insurance and laughed a half-second too late at everyone's jokes, like he was always translating the room before he responded to it. At first, I'd been glad. My mother had been alone a long time, and she lit up around him in a way I hadn't seen since before my father got sick. I wanted that for her. I would have welcomed almost anyone who made her smile like that. But Roland was the kind of man whose control showed up slowly in increments so small you couldn't point to any single one without sounding paranoid. It was the way he started answering questions that were addressed to her. The way the photos of my father came down off the walls one by one over the course of a year until the only one left was in my own bedroom. The way family decisions started getting made in conversations I wasn't in and then announced to me as though they were weather. By the time I left for college, the house I grew up in had become his house, and I was a guest in it who happened to share blood with the woman he'd married. Marin was his daughter from his first marriage, 2 years older than me, and for a long time, I'd resented her without really knowing her. She'd gotten the version of my mother I'd lost. When Marin got engaged, my mother threw herself into the planning with an energy that stunned me, tasting cakes and arguing with florists and crying happy tears at the dress fitting. And when the day came, Roland walked Marin halfway down the aisle. And then my mother took over for the second half, the two of them flanking her like a matched set. And everyone said how beautiful it was, how modern, how generous. I'd watched from the third row. I'd told myself it was fine. I'd told myself that when it was my turn, my mother would be there for me the way she'd been there for Marin. That practiced devotion had a place reserved for her own daughter underneath it. I'd been wrong about that. The way I'd been wrong about a lot of things where my mother was concerned. The wedding she planned with her whole heart was for someone else's child. The one she couldn't be bothered to walk a single aisle for was mine. The day of my wedding arrived, and I felt strangely calm. My father had passed away when I was 12, and I'd always imagined my mother being there for the big moments he couldn't attend. But I'd learned to stop expecting things from her years ago. I woke up before my alarm in the hotel room I'd booked with my bridesmaids, and I lay there in the gray morning light, listening to them breathe. And I waited for the grief to come. It didn't. What came instead was a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in a long time, the quiet of having already lost the thing you were afraid of losing. There was nothing left to dread. My mother had already done the worst version of what she could do. Everything after that was just the day itself, mine to make whatever I wanted of it. My friend Nadia did my makeup while my aunt steamed the wrinkles out of my dress in the bathroom. My aunt was my father's younger sister, and she had been the one steady adult in my life for as long as I could remember. The one who showed up to graduations and called on my birthday and never once asked me to be quieter about how Roland made me feel. When she finished with the dress, she came and stood behind me at the mirror and put her hands on my shoulders and looked at my reflection for a long time. She didn't say anything sentimental. She just said that my father would have liked Elias, that he'd have shaken his hand too hard the way he did with everyone he approved of, and that he would have danced badly at the reception and embarrassed me, and I'd have loved every second of it. Then she fastened my grandmother's pearls around my neck and stepped back and told me I looked like myself, which was the best thing anyone said to me all day. The ceremony was held at a vineyard outside of town. Elias's family filled one side of the aisle, and my small collection of aunts and cousins and friends filled the other. My mother and Roland and Marin sat in the second row because I'd asked my aunt to make sure they weren't in the front. I'd thought about not inviting them at all. Elias had asked me gently, more than once, whether I really wanted them there, and I'd gone back and forth on it for days. In the end, I invited them because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life explaining why I hadn't, and because some stubborn part of me wanted my mother to sit there and watch and understand exactly what she'd given up. I wanted her to see me walk that aisle without her. I wanted it burned into her, the way her refusal had been burned into me. When the music started, I walked down the aisle alone. I kept my head high and my eyes on Elias, waiting for me at the altar. I didn't look at my mother. I didn't need to. I could feel her there in the second row like a held breath, but I promised myself I wouldn't give her a single glance, wouldn't give her the chance to compose her face into something photographable, and I kept that promise. The walk was longer than I expected and shorter than I wanted. With every step, I felt the absence beside me, where an arm should have been, and instead of shrinking into it, I let it make me taller. I had walked alone before. I'd walked alone through most of the last 8 years into rooms where I wasn't wanted, and out of conversations I wasn't part of. This was just the first time everyone could see me do it. The ceremony was beautiful, and Elias cried when he said his vows, which made me cry too. After we were pronounced husband and wife, we walked back down the aisle together, and everyone cheered. At the reception, my aunt gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then cry. She told a story about me at 9 years old organizing a neighborhood protest because the ice cream truck stopped coming down our street, complete with hand-lettered signs, and she said she'd known right then that I was someone who would always notice when something wasn't fair and would never be able to keep quiet about it. She said she'd been right about that and that she'd never been prouder of it than she was today. She didn't mention my mother. She didn't have to. Everyone in that room who knew the family understood the empty space her words were drawing a circle around. Elias's father gave a toast that welcomed me to their family with so much warmth that I almost lost it completely. He said that from the first dinner I came to, he felt like a chair that had always been at their table had finally found the person it was waiting for. He said his family didn't measure love by blood and never had. He looked right at me when he said it, and I had to look down at my plate to keep from crying because I knew it was the kind of thing that should have come from someone else and didn't. And here was this man I'd known for 3 years, saying it like it cost him nothing. Then it was time for the mother-daughter dance. I'd removed it from the program weeks ago, but I hadn't told anyone, except Elias and the DJ. When the DJ announced that we'd be skipping to the bouquet toss, I watched my mother's face from across the room. She looked confused, then hurt, then angry. Roland leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She stood up and walked toward me. I was standing with Elias's mother when my mother approached and asked why there was no mother-daughter dance. I told her there was no mother to dance with. She said that was cruel and unnecessary. I told her that walking your daughter down the aisle was a tradition, and she decided traditions didn't matter when they inconvenienced her husband. So I figured I'd apply the same logic. Her face turned red and she opened her mouth to respond. But Elias appeared beside me and asked if everything was all right. My mother's mouth hung open mid-word when Elias stepped closer to me. I felt Elias's hand settle on the small of my back, warm and steady. And for a second, everything in the reception hall seemed to pause. Then Elias's brother, Reed, moved between us and my mother. Not aggressively, but definitely intentionally, creating a wall of person that made it clear the conversation was over. My mother blinked at Reed like she couldn't quite process what was happening. The music kept playing somewhere behind us, and I could hear people laughing at one of the tables near the dance floor, completely unaware of the tension crackling in our little corner. Elias leaned down close to my ear and asked quietly if I wanted to leave, if this was too much, if we should just go. His voice was gentle, but I could feel how tense his body was next to mine, ready to get me out of there if I said the word. I shook my head and told him, no way. Absolutely not. Because I refused to let my mother chase me out of my own wedding reception. Elias squeezed my hand and nodded, then guided me away from where my mother still stood, looking shocked. Reed stayed put for another few seconds, just standing. A few guests near them pretended to be very interested in the cake options, while obviously listening to every word. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Roland was mad that his plan had backfired, and my mother was probably trying to figure out how to salvage her image. My aunt materialized beside me so suddenly, I almost jumped. She took my hand and squeezed it hard, her eyes bright, and she told me she'd been waiting 8 years to see someone stand up to them like that. Her voice was fierce and proud, and it made my throat tight. She said Elias was a keeper, and that she was glad I'd married someone with a spine. While she was still talking, Roland came up on my other side, smooth as oil, and started in on his speech. He said in that careful, translated voice of his that I'd embarrassed my mother in front of everyone, and that's not how family treats each other. The words came out smooth and practiced like he'd rehearsed them on the walkover. He put his hand on my arm just above the elbow, the way he did when he wanted to steer a conversation, and his face brightened for a second like he thought he'd won. Then I pulled my arm away and turned my back on him. I walked straight toward where Elias's parents were standing near the bar. I didn't look back, but I felt Roland standing there behind me, probably trying to figure out what just happened. Elias appeared at my side again, and his mother reached out to hug me without saying anything, just pulled me in and held on tight. My mother and Roland left maybe 10 minutes later. They made a whole production of it too, gathering their things loudly and saying goodbyes to people near the door in voices that carried across the room. Several guests definitely noticed, and a few looked uncomfortable or confused. Roland kept his hand on my mother's back, steering her toward the exit, and she let herself be steered the way she always did. And watching it from across the room, I felt the last little flicker of hope in me go out. I'd spent 8 years waiting for the moment she would plant her feet and refuse to be moved. It was never going to come. Marin didn't leave with them. She stayed in her seat at a corner table, hunched over a drink, looking like she wanted to sink through the floor. I saw her glance toward the exit when my mother and Roland walked out. Then she looked down at her glass and didn't move. Nadia came up beside me and linked her arm through mine without asking if I was okay or making a big deal of anything. She just announced in this bright, loud voice that it was time for the bouquet toss and started pulling me toward the middle of the dance floor. Suddenly, Elias's cousins were there, and my friends from college and my aunt, all of them crowding around me with big smiles like we were going to have the best time. The DJ caught on quick and started playing upbeat music and calling all the single ladies to the floor. The energy in the room shifted so fast, it almost gave me whiplash from tense and awkward to fun and celebratory. The reception actually became joyful after my mother left. It sounds terrible to say, but it's true. The whole room felt lighter, like someone had opened windows and let fresh air in. People laughed louder and danced more and stopped throwing worried glances at our family drama corner. Elias's mother found me during a slow song and asked if she could have this dance. We moved onto the floor together, and she told me she was honored to have me as a daughter, that her son had chosen, well, that she could see I was strong and kind and exactly the kind of person she'd hoped Elias would find. Her voice was thick with emotion, and her eyes were wet. I started crying a little, but they were good tears for once, the kind that come from feeling valued instead of rejected. She held me the way you hold someone you've decided to keep. She told me quietly, while we swayed, that she'd lost her own mother young, and that for years she'd felt the whole of it, at every wedding and graduation and holiday, and that she knew exactly what that empty seat felt like, and that she was not going to let me sit in front of an empty seat for the rest of my life if she had anything to say about it. She hugged me tight when the song ended and told me I always had a family with them, no matter what. I realized standing there in her arms that this was what having a supportive parent felt like, this warmth and acceptance without conditions or scorekeeping. Marin approached me near the end of the night when I was saying goodbye to some of Elias's relatives. She looked nervous and kept twisting her hands together. She said she needed to apologize for not speaking up sooner about her father's behavior. Her voice was quiet and rushed, like she was afraid I'd walk away before she finished. She said she'd always been scared of Roland's reactions, that she'd learned to just go along to keep the peace. But watching me set boundaries tonight made her realize how messed up their whole dynamic was. She said she was sorry for texting me, that she didn't want to get involved because she should have gotten involved. She should have told her father he was being ridiculous. I looked at Marin standing there looking miserable and conflicted, and I told her I understood. I told her I needed some time, though, that tonight had been a lot, and I couldn't process everything right now. She nodded fast and said she understood, that she'd be there whenever I was ready to talk. She hugged me quickly and then left before I could say anything else. 3 days into our honeymoon at this beach resort with white sand and clear water, Elias and I finally had time to just sit and talk about everything that happened. We were on our balcony watching the sunset with drinks we'd made too strong and our feet propped up on the railing. Elias said he'd never been more proud of anyone than when he watched me walk down that aisle alone. He said watching my mother's face when she realized there would be no dance was satisfying in a way he didn't expect, that he'd wanted to say something to her for months, but seeing her face the consequences of her choices was better. We talked about what boundaries we wanted going forward. Elias said whatever I decided he'd support completely, that if I wanted to cut my mother off entirely, he'd back me up. And if I wanted to try to rebuild something, he'd be there for that too. He said the only thing he cared about was protecting me from being hurt like that again. I leaned against his shoulder and watched the sun turn the ocean orange and red. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe all the way. We stayed out on that balcony until the stars came up. And somewhere in there, the conversation turned to the thing I'd never said out loud to anyone, which was that part of me had spent years believing the problem was me. That if I'd been warmer to Roland, quieter at dinners, more willing to bend, my mother would have stayed mine. Elias listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, he said something I've thought about 100 times since. He said that a parent's love isn't a reward you earn by being convenient. He said that the whole point of it, the thing that makes it different from every other kind of love, is that it's supposed to be the one thing you never have to audition for. And that if I had been auditioning for 8 years, then it had stopped being a parent's love a long time ago, and I should stop grieving something that wasn't there to lose. I cried again, but quietly. And he held my hand on the railing and didn't try to fix it. And the waves came in and went out, and the day finally let go of me. The email from my mother came through on my phone while we were having breakfast by the pool. The subject line said, "We need to talk about your behavior," in all caps. I showed it to Elias, and we both just stared at it for a second. Then Elias started laughing, this genuine amused laugh, and I started laughing too, at the absolute nerve of it. We sat there giggling like kids at the idea that my mother thought she had any right to lecture me about behavior after everything she'd done. I deleted the email without reading past the first line, which started with the words, "I'm very disappointed." Elias flagged down a server and ordered us these fancy tropical drinks with fruit and little umbrellas. We toasted to not letting my mother invade our honeymoon, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks, maybe months. The rest of that day, we swam and ate too much food and didn't check our phones once. I want to say I didn't think about her at all, but that wouldn't be true. I thought about her in the small gaps, the way you keep touching a sore tooth with your tongue, but the thinking didn't have teeth anymore. It was just a dull ache I could set down whenever I wanted, and that was new, and it felt like freedom. When we got home from the honeymoon, there were 2 letters waiting in our mailbox. Both had my mother's return address, and the second one had urgent written across the front in red marker. Elias pulled them out and held them up, asking if I wanted him to just throw them away without opening them. Part of me wanted to say yes, but I told him I should probably read them, that I needed to know what I was dealing with. We sat on our couch and I opened them one at a time. The first letter said I'd caused a scene at my wedding by removing the mother-daughter dance without telling anyone. It said I disrespected Roland and made the whole event about my hurt feelings instead of celebrating marriage. The handwriting was my mother's, but the sentences weren't. They had Roland's careful, lawyerly rhythm, the way he built a case before he delivered a verdict. The second letter was longer and angrier. It said I was manipulated by Elias and that I'd changed since getting engaged. It said Roland was heartbroken by my behavior and that I owed him an apology. Both letters ended with demands that I call her immediately to discuss this like adults. I read them out loud to Elias, and his jaw got tighter with each sentence. I got out my laptop and sat at our kitchen table. Elias pulled up a chair beside me, and we started writing a response together. I typed out what I wanted to say, and Elias helped me edit it, making sure it was firm but not mean, clear but not cruel. The letter explained that her choice not to walk me down the aisle had natural consequences. I wrote that removing the mother-daughter dance was my decision to make, and I wouldn't apologize for protecting myself from more hurt. Elias suggested adding a section about boundaries, and I typed it out carefully. No unannounced visits to our home, no communication through other family members trying to guilt-trip me. No more letters written in my mother's hand, but my stepfather's voice. Any future relationship would require genuine accountability from her. Not apologies for how I felt, but actual ownership of what she'd done. I read it over 3 times, changing words here and there. Elias read it and said it was perfect, that it said everything it needed to say, without being something I'd regret later. I saved it to send in the morning when I had the courage to actually hit the button. I clicked send on the email the next morning while Elias made coffee in our kitchen. My hands shook a little as I watched the message disappear from my drafts folder. Elias came over and kissed the top of my head and told me I did the right thing. I closed my laptop and tried to focus on breakfast, but my stomach felt tight. I kept waiting for the regret to land, the way you brace for a wave you can see coming. It didn't land. What landed instead a few minutes later was something closer to relief, the feeling of having finally said the true thing in plain words after years of swallowing it. I'd spent so long managing my mother's feelings, softening every sentence, leaving doors open she only ever used to walk away. Closing one myself on purpose with my own hand felt less like losing her and more like finally being allowed to stop chasing. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was at work. I saw my aunt's name on the screen and stepped outside to take the call. She sounded almost excited when she started talking. Roland had been calling everyone in the family, apparently. My cousins and my uncle and even some relatives I barely talked to anymore. He was telling them all that I'd humiliated my mother at my own wedding, that I was vindictive and cruel for removing the mother-daughter dance without warning. My aunt laughed a little when she said it. She told me that most of our relatives shut Roland down immediately. My cousin Lena apparently told Roland that my mother humiliated herself by refusing to walk her own daughter down the aisle. My uncle said he didn't want to hear about it and hung up on him. Even my grandmother's sister, who I hadn't seen in years, told Roland he was out of line and asked him who exactly he thought he was, calling around about a girl whose own father wasn't alive to defend her. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing this. I'd always thought my extended family saw me as difficult or dramatic, because that's what my mother implied whenever I complained about Roland. But they saw through him. They knew what he was doing. My aunt said she just wanted me to know I had more support than I probably realized. I thanked her and went back inside, feeling lighter than I had in days. What got to me most when I thought about it later was the part about the phone calls themselves. Roland had spent 8 years building a version of me inside that family. A difficult version, a dramatic version, a girl who couldn't just let things go. He'd done it in small asides at dinners and sympathetic phone calls to relatives, always in that reasonable, translated voice, always positioning himself as the patient stepfather doing his best with a hostile stepdaughter. And it turned out the whole structure was made of paper. The first time he tried to use it openly, the first time he picked up the phone and asked the family to take his side out loud, it collapsed. My uncle hung up on him. My grandmother's sister put him in his place. The story he'd been telling about me for nearly a decade had never actually convinced anyone. They'd been humoring him. The way you humor a man you've decided isn't worth the fight, and the moment he asked them to commit to it, they declined. I'd spent years feeling outnumbered in that family. It turned out I'd never been outnumbered at all. I'd just been out-talked by one persistent man, and everyone else had been quietly waiting for someone to stop letting him talk. 2 weeks after the wedding, I was still in my pajamas on a Saturday morning when I heard a knock at our apartment door. Elias was in the shower, so I walked over and looked through the peephole. My mother stood in the hallway looking angry and determined, and Roland stood just behind her shoulder, which told me everything I needed to know about whose idea the visit was. My whole body went cold. I backed away from the door as Elias came out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist, asking who it was. I told him it was my mother and Roland, and Elias's expression changed immediately. He pulled on sweatpants and a shirt faster than I'd ever seen him move. The knocking got louder, and then I heard my mother's voice demanding to see me, saying she knew I was home because my car was in the parking lot. Behind her voice, I could hear Roland's lower coaching. The way a man feeds lines to someone he's put on stage. Elias walked to the door and opened it just enough to stand in the frame, blocking the entrance. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. He told them they needed to leave. My mother tried to push past him, but Elias didn't move. he said, showing up unannounced violated the boundaries. I clearly stated in my letter and that they needed to respect those boundaries or there would be consequences. My mother's face turned red, and she started saying that I was her daughter and she had a right to talk to me. Roland put his hand on her arm, and I watched through the gap in the door as he tried to take over the conversation, tried to slide into his reasonable voice and explain to Elias how families work. That was when I walked to the door and stood beside Elias. I told my mother through the gap that she needed to respect my boundaries, or there would be no relationship at all. And then I looked past her at Roland and told him that the next time he wanted to say something to me, he could do it in his own name instead of hiding behind hers. My mother looked at me like I'd slapped her. Her face got even redder, and she said I was manipulated by Elias, that I never acted like this before I got married. Elias actually laughed at that. He said, maybe she never had someone supporting her enough to stand up for herself before. My mother opened her mouth and closed it again. She had no response to that truth. Roland did, of course. Roland always had a response, and he started to deliver it. Something about how disappointed they both were and how this wasn't the daughter they raised. I cut him off. I told him he didn't raise me. I told him he married my mother when I was already most of the way grown, and that he'd spent the years since trying to erase the family that came before him, and that it hadn't worked because I remembered my father. I remembered who my mother used to be, and no amount of taking pictures down off walls was going to make me forget. Roland's mouth opened and closed the same way my mother's had. For once in his life, he didn't have the next line ready. They stood there for another few seconds, looking between Elias and me like they were waiting for one of us to break. When neither of us did, they turned and walked away down the hallway. Elias closed the door and locked it. I realized I was shaking. Elias pulled me into a hug, and I stood there trying to catch my breath, but I also felt strangely powerful. Elias had physically stood between me and my mother's boundary violations, and I'd held my ground. And for the first time, I'd said the true things to Roland's face instead of swallowing them. We called Elias's parents an hour later to tell them what happened. They invited us for dinner immediately, saying family supports family. That evening at their house, Elias's mother hugged me tight when we walked in. She said she was sorry my mother couldn't see what an amazing daughter she had. I felt that grief again for the parent relationship I would never have. But I also felt grateful for the family I was building with Elias. Over dinner, Elias's father told a story about his own brother, a man he hadn't spoken to in 15 years, and how the hardest and best thing he'd ever done was accept that some people show you who they are, and the kindest response is to believe them. He didn't say it like a lesson. He said it like a man passing along something he'd paid full price for, and I took it the way it was offered, and I held on to it. A month after the wedding, Marin texted me asking if we could meet for coffee without her father knowing. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I was curious. I agreed to meet at a cafe across town where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. Marin was already there when I arrived, looking tired and older than I remembered. She ordered a latte and I got tea, and we sat at a corner table away from other customers. She admitted that living with Roland's constant manipulation was exhausting. She said she'd been walking on eggshells her whole life trying to keep her father happy. I listened and watched her twist her napkin into shreds. She told me watching me set boundaries at the wedding made something click for her. She realized she didn't have to keep sacrificing her own peace for her father's ego. We talked for almost 2 hours, and I saw my stepsister clearly for the first time. She was someone also damaged by Roland's need for control, just in different ways than me. When we left the cafe, Marin hugged me and thanked me for meeting her. I drove home from that coffee in a strange daze. For 8 years, I'd thought of Marin as the winner, the chosen one, the daughter who got the version of my mother I'd lost. It had never once occurred to me that Marin might be drowning in her own version of the same water. She wasn't getting love either. She was getting management. Roland had walked her halfway down the aisle and let my mother take the other half. And Marin had stood there in the middle of it, smiling for the photographs. And inside, she'd been doing the same math I'd been doing across town. The math of what it cost to keep a controlling parent satisfied. The running tally of small surrenders. We'd been on opposite sides of the same wall the whole time, each of us assuming the other one had it easy. It made me sad in a way I hadn't expected. Not for myself for once, for both of us. For the years we'd spent resenting each other when we'd been hostages in the same house. The next week, Marin told me more about life with Roland. She said her father had been obsessed with making sure her wedding was better than anything anyone else in the family had done. He kept comparing everything, keeping score like it was a competition. And he'd pushed my mother to throw herself into the planning specifically so that everyone would see how generous and blended and superior their family was. Marin said it made her own wedding day stressful instead of joyful. She admitted she'd felt relieved when she moved out after getting married, but the guilt Roland laid on her for not visiting enough was crushing. He called her 3 times a week, she said, and every call was a quiet inventory of her failures delivered so gently you couldn't object to any single sentence. I told her about the years of feeling invisible in my own family while Roland played the patient stepfather. We sat there comparing notes and realizing how many of the same tactics he used on both of us. The difference was Marin had lived with it her whole life and thought it was normal. She didn't have a before. I at least had a memory of a mother who'd once belonged to me. Marin had only ever had Roland, and Roland had only ever had a daughter he could move around like furniture. I invited Marin to have dinner with Elias and me the following week. I wanted to keep it separate from all the Roland drama. The three of us had a surprisingly good time. Marin and Elias bonded over their shared love of terrible action movies. We laughed until my sides hurt, talking about the worst films we'd ever seen. The ones with explosions that made no physical sense and one-liners so bad they wrapped back around to brilliant. At one point, Marin was laughing so hard she had to put her fork down, and I caught Elias watching her with this soft look. And later, when she'd gone home, he told me he was glad I was building a relationship with Marin on our own terms, away from the people who'd taught us both to compete instead of connect. Marin texted me afterwards saying she hadn't laughed that much in months and asking if we could make it a regular thing. I said yes. 3 months after the wedding, I took a pregnancy test in our bathroom while Elias waited outside the door. The 2 lines appeared immediately. I opened the door and showed him, and we both just stared at it for a minute before he picked me up and spun me around. But the joy got complicated fast. That night in bed, I asked Elias what role my mother would have in our child's life. He got quiet and said he'd been thinking about the same thing. We spent several evenings talking through different options. Supervised visits where my mother and Roland couldn't be alone with the baby, limited contact on holidays only, or no contact at all to protect our child from the same prioritization of stepfamily that hurt me. I was torn between wanting my child to have a grandmother and protecting them from my mother's choices. Elias said whatever I decided he would support completely, but that our child's well-being came first. The thing I kept circling back to in those late-night conversations was a specific fear that was hard to even say out loud. It wasn't just that my mother might hurt our child the way she'd hurt me. It was that she might do to my child exactly what she'd done with Marin, that she'd shower some other kid with the warmth she'd withheld from me, and that my own child would grow up watching it, learning the same lesson I'd learned, that love in our family was a thing you competed for and usually lost. I couldn't do that to a baby that didn't even exist yet. I couldn't hand my mother the chance to teach a third generation that affection was conditional, and that some children mattered more than others. Elias listened to me work through all of it, and when I finally got to the bottom of it, he said the simplest true thing. He said our kid would have exactly one childhood, and we got to decide who was allowed to be in the room for it. And that wasn't cruelty. That was the job. That was the whole job. Before I could make any decision, my aunt accidentally mentioned my pregnancy to my mother during a phone call. She called me right after to apologize, saying it slipped out when my mother asked how I was doing. Within hours, I got an email from my mother. The subject line said, "Congratulations," in all caps. I opened it and felt my blood pressure spike as I read. She assumed she would be an involved grandmother. She included suggestions for nursery colors and asked when we planned to find out the gender. She wrote that she hoped this could be a fresh start for all of us and that a baby had a way of putting old hurts in perspective. There was a paragraph, clearly Roland's, about how grandparents these days played such an important role and how studies showed children with involved extended family did better in school. The presumption that she automatically got access to my child after refusing to walk me down the aisle made me furious in a way I didn't expect. I showed Elias the email and he read it with his jaw clenched tight. He pointed out quietly that not once in the entire message did she say she was sorry. She'd skipped straight past the wedding, past the letters, past the doorstep, as though all of it had simply expired and arrived at her grandchild with her hand already out. We sat down that night and created a detailed plan for grandparent boundaries. Any relationship with our child would require genuine accountability from my mother first, a real apology. Not just sorry for how I felt, acknowledgement of what she'd actually done wrong, commitment to treating me with respect going forward, and an end to Roland speaking for her or scripting her words. I drafted an email explaining that being a grandparent was a privilege earned through respect and healthy relationships, not an automatic right. I wrote that I would not expose my child to someone who couldn't prioritize their own daughter's feelings. The email sat in my drafts for 2 days while I tweaked the wording. I sent it to Nadia to read over. She called me immediately and said it was perfect. She said I was protecting my child the way I wished someone had protected me from Roland's influence all those years. I saved the final version and told Elias I needed one more night to be sure. He said to take all the time I needed because this decision would affect our whole family. I sent the email the next morning after Elias read it one more time and nodded. The send button felt heavy under my finger, but I pressed it anyway. We went about our day, trying not to think about it, but every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. 3 days passed with nothing. Then a week, then 2 weeks. I started to relax into the silence. My aunt called to check in, and I told her about the email and the boundaries. She said she was proud of me for protecting my child before they were even born. She also told me carefully that Roland had called her again fishing, asking whether I'd said anything about letting them see the baby. My aunt had told him that he'd have to take that up with me directly, knowing full well he never would, because direct was the one thing Roland had never once been. Marin texted asking how I was feeling and if I needed anything. I told her I was good and asked how the apartment search was going. She said she'd looked at 3 places and was putting in an application for one near downtown, the first place she'd ever rented that her father wouldn't have a key to. I told her that was great and meant it. At my next doctor appointment, Elias held my hand while we listened to the heartbeat through the Doppler. The sound filled the small exam room, and I watched Elias's face light up. The doctor said everything looked perfect and asked if we had any questions. I asked about stress during pregnancy, and she said some stress was normal, but to try to minimize it where possible. I thought about my mother's silence and realized it was actually helping. No angry letters meant no spike in blood pressure. No manipulation attempts meant I could focus on growing a healthy baby. The doctor scheduled our anatomy scan for the following month and said we could find out the gender then if we wanted. Elias squeezed my hand and I squeezed back. On the drive home, I caught myself doing something I hadn't done in years, which was making plans without first running them through the filter of how my mother and Roland would react. I'd lived so long inside that filter, I'd stopped noticing it. Now that it was gone, the future felt suddenly wide, like a window that had been painted shut, my whole life finally sliding open. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I recognized my mother's handwriting on the envelope and my stomach clenched. I set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it. Elias came home from work and found me still standing there. He asked if I wanted him to read it first. I shook my head and opened it. The letter was 2 pages long. My mother started by saying she was sorry I was hurt by her decision about the wedding. She said she never intended to cause me pain. Then she said that Roland's feelings had to be considered too because they were married and that's what marriage meant. She wrote that she hoped I could understand her position now that I was married myself. She said she was excited to be a grandmother and asked when the baby was due. She suggested we could work out a visitation schedule that worked for everyone. The last paragraph said she hoped I could move past this for the baby's sake because family was important. I read it twice to make sure I understood what I was reading. Then I handed it to Elias. He read it standing next to me at the counter. When he finished, he looked at me and asked if I saw it too. I asked what he meant. He pointed to the second paragraph and said that my mother was apologizing for my feelings, not her actions. He said there was no actual acknowledgement of what she'd done wrong. No understanding of why walking Roland's daughter down the aisle, but refusing to walk me, was hurtful. No accountability for choosing her husband's comfort over her daughter's wedding. Just sorry you feel that way, and let's move forward because I want access to your baby. He read the line about understanding her position, now that I was married, and he laughed without any humor in it and said that the message underneath that sentence was that I should expect to make the same choice someday, to put a man over my own child and to think of that as maturity. He said that was the part that scared him. Not that she wouldn't apologize. That she genuinely believed there was nothing to apologize for. I felt something shift in my chest. Elias was right. This wasn't an apology. This was my mother trying to use my child as leverage to avoid actually dealing with what she'd done. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Elias asked what I was doing. I said I was writing back one more time to make things absolutely clear. He pulled up a chair next to me and put his hand on my shoulder while I typed. I wrote that I appreciated her reaching out, but that her letter confirmed what I already knew. I wrote that apologizing for how I felt was not the same as apologizing for what she did. I wrote that until she could acknowledge that refusing to walk her biological daughter down the aisle while walking her stepdaughter was wrong. We had nothing to discuss. I wrote that being a grandmother was a privilege earned through respect and healthy relationships. I wrote that if she couldn't prioritize her daughter, then she wouldn't have access to her grandchild. I wrote that I would not negotiate on this boundary and that the decision was entirely hers to make. I added one more line at the end. One Elias didn't suggest. One that was only mine. I wrote that I had spent my whole childhood being walked away from, and that my child was never going to know what that felt like. Not from me, and not from anyone I let into the room. The email sat in my drafts for 3 days. I read it every morning and every night. I changed a few words. I deleted a sentence and added it back. Elias asked if I was sure, and I said no, but I was doing it anyway. On the 3rd night, I read it one more time with Elias sitting beside me. He asked if I meant every word. I said yes. He said, then send it. I clicked send and closed the laptop. We sat there in the quiet of our kitchen, and I waited to feel something. Regret, maybe, or fear. Instead, I just felt tired. Elias asked if I was okay. I said, I don't know yet, but I will be. He made us tea, and we sat on the couch and didn't talk. And somewhere in that silence, the tiredness turned into something steadier, something that felt almost like peace, the kind you only get after you've stopped bracing for a blow that isn't coming anymore. Weeks went by with no response. My inbox stayed empty of emails from my mother. No letters arrived in the mail. Marin called me one afternoon while I was folding laundry. She said she needed to tell me something. I asked what. She said Roland had been ranting for days about being excluded from the pregnancy, about how ungrateful I was, about how my mother had given me everything. And this was the thanks she got. But here was the part Marin wanted me to hear. She said my mother mostly stayed quiet during these rants. That she just sat there at the kitchen table while Roland paced and listed my crimes, and that more than once Marin had caught her staring at the wall with an expression Marin had never seen on her before. Sad, Marin said, not angry. sad and far away, like a woman doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. Marin said she thought my mother wanted to reach out but didn't know how to do it without admitting Roland was wrong. And that admitting Roland was wrong was the one thing my mother had organized her entire second life around never having to do. I asked Marin how she was doing. She said she'd signed the lease on her apartment and was moving out next weekend for real this time. The boxes were already half-packed. She asked if Elias and I could help her move. I said yes without hesitating. There was a symmetry to it that I didn't say out loud, but felt all the way down. Roland had spent years separating me from my family, one photograph at a time, and here I was, helping his daughter carry her life out of his house, box by box, into a place he wouldn't have a key to. He taught us both to compete. Instead, we were going to leave together. My pregnancy progressed into the 4th month without the constant stress of my mother's manipulation. My doctor commented that my blood pressure was excellent. I started showing enough that strangers could tell I was pregnant. Elias's mother called every week to check in and ask how I was feeling. She never mentioned my mother. She never asked if we'd heard from her. She just asked about me and the baby and if we needed anything. Sometimes she called just to tell me a small thing, a recipe she thought I'd like, a story about Elias as a toddler, and I came to understand that this was its own kind of message. That she was showing me what it looked like to be in someone's life without an agenda, to call for no reason except that you wanted to hear the person's voice. I'd never had a parent call me for no reason. I hadn't known until then that I'd been waiting my whole life for a phone to ring like that. The weekend we helped Marin move, the 4 of us. Marin and Elias's brother Reed and me, carried furniture up 2 flights of stairs in the August heat and ordered too much pizza and sat on the floor of her empty new living room eating it out of the box. Marin looked around the bare walls and said she could put my father's pictures up here if I wanted, that she'd kept a few from before Roland took them down, that she'd quietly rescued them out of a box in the garage years ago and never said anything. I didn't know what to say. This girl I'd resented for 8 years had been protecting my father's face from her own father's eraser the whole time, in secret, expecting nothing for it. I told her to keep them up at her place for now, where they'd be safe, and that someday, when my kid was old enough, I'd want them to see what their grandfather looked like. The real one. The one who'd put me on his shoulders at the fair. Marin said she'd hold on to them until then. Reed, who didn't know the whole story, just said the man in the photos had a good face, and we let that be the toast. And we ate the rest of the pizza, and it was one of the best nights I'd had in years. At my anatomy scan, we found out we were having a boy. Elias cried in the exam room while the technician printed pictures. I cried too, but for different reasons. I was happy about the baby, but sad that my mother was missing this. Then I reminded myself that she was choosing to miss it. She had a phone. She had my address. She had every chance in the world to be a different woman than the one she decided to be. And at any point in the last several months, she could have picked up the pen and written the 4 or 5 honest sentences that would have changed everything. And she hadn't, because writing them meant looking at Roland across the dinner table and telling him he was wrong. And she would rather lose her daughter and her grandson than do that. The sadness was real, but it had a clean edge to it. Now, it was the sadness of watching someone walk away on purpose, which is different from the sadness of being left. A few days after the scan, I drove the 2 hours out to my aunt's house alone, because there was something I'd been needing to do for months and hadn't found the nerve for. I wanted to ask her about my father, not the broad strokes I already carried, the shoulders at the fair, the 2 hard handshakes, but the small things, the real things, the texture of a man I'd lost at 12 and had been slowly forgetting in pieces ever since. Every year, a few more details going soft at the edges. With my son coming, with the decision made to name him Owen, I'd been gripped by a panic that I wouldn't have enough to give him, that all I'd be able to tell my boy about the grandfather he was named for was that he died and that he'd been kind, and that wasn't a person. That was an outline. My aunt made tea, and we sat at her kitchen table for the whole afternoon. And she gave my father back to me one story at a time. She told me he'd been a terrible singer who sang anyway loudly in the car, that he'd had a particular war with a single squirrel in his backyard for 3 summers running, that he'd cried at every wedding and pretended it was allergies. She told me he'd kept a list. She actually used that word, a list of every clever thing I said as a small child, written on the backs of receipts and stuffed in a coffee can, and that the can was in her attic. And she went and got it. And we read them together. My own 4-year-old observations in my father's handwriting, and I understood for the first time where Elias and his list had come from, that I'd married a man who loved the way my father had loved by paying attention and writing it down so it couldn't be lost. My aunt said she'd been waiting years to give me that can. She'd thought about it at my high school graduation and my college graduation and my wedding, and each time she decided the moment wasn't right, that Roland would be there, that my mother would make it about herself, that the can deserved better than to be opened in the wrong room. She said this was the right room. She was right. She told me one more thing before I left. The thing I think I'd actually driven 2 hours to hear. She said that my father had loved my mother completely, that he'd have been heartbroken by who she'd become, but that he would not have been surprised by what I'd done, by the boundaries, by the closed door, by any of it. She said, "Your father had a phrase he used, that you teach people how to treat you, and he'd have been proud, fiercely proud, to see his daughter finally teaching the lesson instead of just learning it over and over." She said it like she was passing along a verdict from a court that had been adjourned for 18 years. And I carried it back down the highway with the coffee can on the passenger seat, and somewhere around the halfway point, I had to pull over because I couldn't see the road. And I sat on the shoulder with the can in my lap and let myself cry for my father in a way I hadn't allowed since I was 12. The deep kind, the kind that finishes something. When it was done, I felt scrubbed clean. I drove the rest of the way home and put the coffee can on the nursery shelf next to Marin's album, 2 collections of my father, waiting for a boy who'd carry his name. That night, I told Elias what kind of mother I wanted to be, out loud, as a promise, because I'd learned by then that the things you don't say out loud have a way of slipping. I told him I wanted to be the kind of mother whose love our son never had to earn, never had to audition for, never had to win against another child. I told him I wanted Owen to grow up so certain of his place in our family that he'd find it boring, that he'd roll his eyes at how obviously we loved him, that being chosen would be so ordinary to him, he'd never once lie awake wondering about it the way I had. Elias listened to all of it, and then he said the thing that let me finally sleep. He said I'd already proven I could do it, that the entire last 9 months had been one long demonstration, that a woman who would close a door on her own mother to protect a child who didn't exist yet was not a woman who was ever going to make that child compete for anything. He said, "The proof is already in, you just have to live inside it now." So I did. Elias's parents invited us over for dinner the following Saturday. We drove to their house in the suburbs, and Elias's mother answered the door with a huge smile. She hugged me carefully and asked how I was feeling. I said good, and meant it. Elias's father gave Elias a hug and shook my hand, then pulled me into a hug too. We sat down to eat, and halfway through dinner, Elias's mother cleared her throat. She said they had something they wanted to share with us. Elias's father smiled and said they'd been working on a project. Elias asked what kind of project. His mother said they were converting their guest room into a nursery for when we visited with the baby. She pulled out paint samples from her purse and spread them on the table. She asked which colors I liked best. I stared at the samples and felt my throat get tight. She was asking my opinion. She was including me in decisions about my child. She was treating me like I was truly her daughter. I pointed to a soft sage green and said I liked that one. She smiled and said that was her favorite too. Elias's father said they'd already ordered a crib and a changing table, and that he'd been reading about the safest way to anchor a bookshelf to a wall so it couldn't tip over. And he said it with such serious pride that Elias laughed and told him the baby wasn't going to be climbing bookshelves for a couple of years yet. His father said he liked to be prepared. He said he wanted us to feel comfortable bringing the baby over any time, that the door was always open, that there would never be a holiday or a birthday or an ordinary Tuesday when this child wasn't welcome in their home. Elias reached under the table and took my hand. I squeezed it hard. The contrast between this warm inclusion and my mother's absence hit me like a physical thing. But sitting there with Elias's parents, planning for our son, surrounded by paint samples and anchored bookshelves and a list of safety upgrades made by a man I'd known for 3 years, I realized something. Chosen family could be just as real as blood, maybe more real because it was based on actual care instead of obligation. I thought about that a lot over the following weeks. The difference between obligation and care. My mother had treated me as an obligation for years, something she was supposed to love because the rules said so. A box on a form she kept ticking while her actual attention went elsewhere. And the strange cruelty of obligation is that it looks almost like love from a distance. It shows up to the right events. It signs the cards. It says the words. But there's nothing behind the words. And a child can feel that emptiness even when they can't name it, the way you can feel a cold draft in a room without finding the window. Elias's parents had no obligation to me at all. There was no rule that said they had to make room. They'd done it anyway freely because they'd looked at me and decided I was worth making room for. I was almost 30 years old, and that was the first time in my conscious memory that anyone had chosen me when they didn't have to. I kept waiting for it to feel normal. It never quite did. It just felt like sunlight after a long time indoors. Marin and I met for coffee the next week to plan the baby shower. She brought a notebook full of ideas and was genuinely excited. We picked a date 6 weeks out and started making a guest list. She asked if I wanted to do a theme. I said, not really. She said okay and wrote down, no theme. We talked about food and games and decorations. She mentioned she'd moved into her apartment over the weekend and that she'd already hung my father's pictures in her hallway and that every time she walked past them, she thought about how strange it was that the man in the photos had been more of a parent to me in memory than her father had ever managed to be in person. I asked her how the move felt now that it was done. She said, weird, but good. She said, Roland had called her 4 times already trying to guilt her into coming back, that he'd told her the apartment was a waste of money, that he'd told her she was abandoning the family, that he'd even told her she was being influenced by me, which made us both laugh because it was the exact line my mother had used about Elias. I asked if she was going to go back. She said no. She said living on her own was the first time she'd felt like she could breathe in years. I told her I was proud of her. She looked surprised, then smiled, and I understood that nobody had ever said those words to her before, that her whole life had been a series of performances graded by a father who only ever noticed the missed notes. The baby shower happened on a sunny Saturday in May. Marin had rented a small event space and decorated it with sage green and white balloons. Elias's whole family came. My aunt drove in from 2 hours away. Nadia brought her new boyfriend. My cousins came with their kids. My uncle showed up too, the one who'd hung up on Roland. And he hugged me at the door and said he wished he'd done it years ago. Hung up on that man? Said something, taken my side out loud instead of just privately disapproving. And I told him he was here now and that was what mattered. Marin greeted everyone at the door and directed them to the food table. I sat in a chair that Marin had decorated with ribbons and open presents, baby clothes and blankets and books and toys piled up around me. Elias's mother had bought us a stroller. My aunt gave me my father's baby blanket, a soft, worn blue thing she'd been keeping safe in a cedar chest for 30 years. The blanket my father had been wrapped in when he was born, and she said now his grandson could be wrapped in it too. And I had to stop opening presents for a minute because I couldn't see through the tears. Nadia got us a year's supply of diapers and said she'd calculated how many we'd need down to the week and had a spreadsheet to prove it. Marin's gift was last. She'd made a photo album, and when I opened it, I found it wasn't pictures of the two of us, the way I'd half expected. It was pictures of my father, the ones she'd rescued from the garage all those years ago, scanned and printed and arranged with dates underneath in her careful handwriting. A whole album of the parent I'd lost given to me by the stepsister. I'd spent 8 years resenting so that my son would grow up knowing his grandfather's face, even though they'd never meet. I hugged her and she hugged me back hard, and neither of us said anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have been bigger than what she'd already done. No one mentioned my mother, but I caught Elias's mother watching me during the gift opening with kind understanding in her eyes. She knew what it meant to celebrate without certain family members. She knew the bittersweet nature of joy mixed with loss. When the party wound down and people started leaving, she helped me pack up the gifts. She asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it. I was surrounded by people who actually showed up for me. People who celebrated without conditions. People who loved without keeping score. That was worth more than blood relation. That was real family. A week after the shower, Roland tried one more time, the way I'd known he eventually would. Because men like Roland never accept a closed door. They just look for a window. This time, he didn't come himself. He sent my mother's older brother, my Uncle Theodore, a man I barely knew because Roland had quietly steered us apart years ago, the same way he'd steered apart everything that connected my mother to her life before him. Theodore called me out of nowhere, friendly at first, asking about the pregnancy, and then slowly working his way around to the real subject, which was that my mother was devastated, that she cried at night, that I was breaking her heart, that surely now with a baby coming, I could find it in myself to forgive and forget for everyone's sake. I let him talk. When he finished, I asked him one question. I asked him whether in all of this my mother had ever once said the words, "I was wrong." There was a long pause on the line. Then Theodore admitted that no, she hadn't. That what she'd actually said was that I was being unreasonable and that Roland was being so patient about it. And I said that was my answer, and that I appreciated him calling, and that he was welcome in my life and my child's life anytime he wanted, but not as a messenger, and that if Roland used him as a phone again, the welcome would close. Theodore was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I didn't expect. He said he was sorry. He said he'd let that man cut him off from his own niece for the better part of a decade without ever asking himself why, and that hearing me lay it out so plainly made him ashamed. He asked if he could take me to lunch sometime, just the two of us. No agenda, no messages to deliver. I said, I'd like that. So Roland, trying to send a weapon into my life, accidentally returned an uncle to me instead. That happened more than once in those months. Every time Roland reached for a tool to use against me, the tool turned out to be a person, and the person given a clear choice for once chose me. The package came a few days later. No note, just a box left at our apartment door, and inside it, a tiny knit cardigan and hat in pale yellow, soft and obviously expensive. The kind of thing my mother would have picked, the kind of thing she was good at, choosing the perfect object as a substitute for the harder work of being a person. There was no card, just the gift, sitting there. A soft little bribe with no apology attached. Elias asked what I wanted to do with it. I held it for a while. It was a beautiful little cardigan, and some part of me, the part that would probably never fully heal, wanted to keep it. Wanted my son to wear something his grandmother had chosen. Wanted there to be one thread connecting him to her, even if she'd cut every other one herself. But I knew what keeping it would mean. It would mean accepting the terms my mother kept trying to set. The terms where she got to skip the apology and arrive directly at the grandchild, where a soft yellow cardigan could stand in for the 4 honest sentences she still wouldn't write. So I packed it back up and we drove it to a donation center across town, and I gave it to a charity that helps new parents who have nothing. And I told myself that the cardigan would keep some baby warm who actually needed it, and that this was a better fate for it than living in my son's closet as a monument to everything his grandmother wouldn't say. By the 7th month, I had stopped checking my phone with dread. The silence from my mother had gone from a wound to a weather pattern, just the climate I lived in now. And most days, I forgot it was there at all. I was deep in the part of pregnancy where the baby felt less like an idea and more like a roommate, kicking me awake at 3 in the morning, pressing a heel into my ribs while I tried to eat dinner. Elias talked to him every night, his mouth against the curve of my belly, telling him about his day, about the people who were waiting to meet him, naming them one by one. His grandmother, who was painting a room sage green. His grandfather, who'd anchored every bookshelf in 2 houses. His Aunt Marin, who'd already bought him more books than any baby could read in 10 years. His great-aunt, who'd kept a blue blanket safe for 30 years. His great-uncles, both of them. The one who'd hung up a phone and the one who'd put down a message. Elias would list them all. This whole architecture of people who'd chosen our son before he'd even arrived. And somewhere in the listing, I'd usually fall asleep, safe inside the sound of it. Elias's mother started coming over on weekends to help me set up the nursery in our own apartment, a smaller version of the one she was building at her house. She was the one who taught me how to fold the impossible little outfits. The one who stood in the paint store with me for an hour debating shades of the same green. The one who held the ladder while I refused to let her climb it. One afternoon, while we were folding a basket of newborn clothes that looked too small to be real, she stopped and put her hand on my arm and told me she wanted to say something, and then she'd never say it again because she didn't want to keep prodding a bruise. She said she knew she could never replace what I'd lost, and she wasn't trying to, but she said that whatever my mother had failed to give me, she had it spare and it was mine. No strings, no scorekeeping for as long as I wanted it. She said it plainly, folding a onesie, not looking at me the way you say the truest things, and I put my face in my hands and cried over a basket of baby clothes. And she let me. And then we kept folding, because the laundry doesn't stop for anybody. And that was its own kind of comfort. Marin came to every appointment she could get off work for. She and I had become over those months something neither of us had a word for. Closer than friends, realer than the stepsisters we'd been pretending to be for years. She was the one I called when the baby's kick scared me. The one who looked it up and told me it was normal and stayed on the phone until I calmed down. She told me once late at night that she'd spent her whole life wanting a sister and had spent 8 years with one in the next family over without ever getting to have her because Roland had needed us to be rivals. Because a man who keeps score needs everyone around him keeping score too. She said the best thing that had ever happened to her was the day my mother refused to walk me down the aisle because that was the day the whole rotten structure finally cracked. And through the crack, for the first time, she could see me. I told her that was a strange thing to be grateful for. She said she'd take her gifts where she found them. So would I by then. So would I. The family reunion happened at the lake that summer, the way it had every year of my life. And for the first time in nearly a decade, I went without dreading it. It was my grandmother's sister, the one who'd told Roland he was out of line, who hosted it, and she'd called me personally to make sure I was coming, which she'd never bothered to do before, and which told me the whole shape of the family had quietly shifted under me without my noticing. I went 6 months pregnant in a sundress with Elias on one arm and Marin on the other, and I did not tell my mother we'd be there because I didn't owe her my schedule anymore. But she came anyway, late, with Roland, because somebody had mentioned it on the family group chat she was still on, and she'd decided, I think, that a public setting was her best chance, that I wouldn't make a scene in front of everyone, that the crowd would do for her what she couldn't do for herself. She was wrong about that, but not in the way she expected. I didn't make a scene. I didn't have to. When my mother and Roland came down the slope toward the gathering, I watched something happen that I will remember for the rest of my life. The family closed. Not dramatically. Not with any single gesture you could point to, but the way a body closes a wound, cells moving quietly into a gap. My uncle drifted over and stood near me. My cousin Lena appeared at my other shoulder with her baby on her hip. My grandmother's sister intercepted Roland before he was halfway down the slope and engaged him in a conversation he couldn't politely leave, steering him away from me with the practiced ease of a woman who'd been managing difficult men since before Roland was born. And my mother stood there at the edge of the gathering, looking for a way in, and there wasn't one. Every approach she made, someone was already there, not hostile, just present. A wall of people who decided without ever holding a meeting that I was the one they'd stand around. Roland tried to work the crowd, of course. I watched him move from group to group with his careful smile, telling his version, the one where I was difficult and he was patient. And I watched it die in real time on face after face. People who'd nodded along to that story for years just looked at him now, polite and unmoving, and let the silence sit until he ran out of words and moved on. At one point, I caught my mother watching me from across the lawn while I laughed at something Lena's baby was doing, and the look on her face was the loneliest thing I'd ever seen. The face of a woman standing outside a window watching a warm room she used to live in, and I felt to my own surprise no triumph at all, just a kind of sorrow for both of us. And underneath it, steady as a heartbeat, the certainty that I was not going to open the window. She'd had the key the whole time. She still did. She just had to be willing to set down the one thing she was holding. And she wasn't. And that was hers to carry, not mine. They left within the hour. As they were going, Roland made the mistake of trying one last move, and it was aimed at Marin. He found her by the dock and started in on her, low and reasonable, that she was embarrassing him, that she was choosing strangers over family, that he'd given her everything. And this was the thanks he got. I'd heard the speech. It was the same one he'd given me through a cracked door, the same one he'd sent through my uncle on the phone, the same script he ran on everyone because it was the only one he had. But this time, I got to watch from a distance as the person he aimed it at finally stopped flinching. Marin let him finish. Then she said loud enough that I could hear it from the slope that he hadn't given her everything. He'd given her conditions, and she was done meeting them, and the strangers he was so upset about had shown her more real family in 6 months than he'd managed in 30 years. Roland's mouth opened and closed in that way I knew so well. The way of a man whose script has run out and who has nothing underneath it. Then he turned and walked up the slope to where my mother was waiting, and the two of them left together. And Marin walked back to us along the shore with her shoulders down and her eyes wet. And I met her halfway, and we just held on to each other at the edge of the water while the family kept laughing behind us. And she said into my shoulder that it was the first time in her life she'd ever talked back to him, and that she felt sick and that she'd never felt better. I told her that was exactly right. That it was both. Always at first the sick and the free all at once, and then slowly just the free. That night, Roland called Marin 11 times, and she didn't pick up a single one. She came and stayed at our apartment instead on the couch, and the three of us ate ice cream out of the carton at midnight and watched one of the terrible action movies she and Elias loved. And at some point, I looked over, and she was asleep with the empty carton in her lap, and Elias was asleep next to her. And I sat there in the blue light of the television with my hand on my belly and thought that this exact picture was the family Roland had spent 8 years trying to prevent, and he'd assembled it himself by accident. The day my mother chose him over me, he'd lit the match. He just hadn't understood what was going to catch fire. There was one more night I have to tell about because it was the closest I came. About a month after the reunion, my mother called and left a voicemail, and it was her real voice this time. No script, no Roland in the sentences. She said my name. She said she'd heard from Lena that I was getting big, that the baby would be here soon. She said she'd seen me at the lake laughing, and that I'd looked happy, and that she was glad, and that she was sorry she'd missed so much. She said she didn't know how to do this. Her voice broke on that word, this. And then there was a long silence on the recording where I could hear her breathing, trying to find the next sentence, and the sentence I was waiting for, the one that started with, I was wrong, never came. And after a while, the voicemail just ended. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to it 4 times. My thumb hovered over her name. I wanted to call her back so badly. It felt like a physical pull, like the baby itself was leaning toward her, toward the idea of a grandmother, toward the simple animal wish for your own mother when you're about to become one yourself. Elias found me there. He didn't tell me what to do. He never once in any of it told me what to do. He just sat down beside me and asked what the voicemail said. And I played it for him. And we listened to it together in the dark. The breathing, the broken word, the silence where the apology should have been. When it ended, he was quiet for a while. Then he asked me one question. He asked whether if I called her back right now, I thought I'd be calling the woman who'd left that voicemail or the woman who'd go right back to Roland's kitchen table in the morning and let him write the next letter. And I knew the answer. And I think I'd known it the whole time. The voicemail was real, but it was a weather event, not a climate. It would pass, and the climate would return. And the climate was a woman who would always, when it came down to a choice, choose the man over the child. I put the phone down. I didn't call her back. It was the hardest thing I did in the whole 9 months. Harder than the doorstep. Harder than any letter, because it meant grieving not just the mother I'd had, but the one who'd left that voicemail. The one who almost made it. The one who got all the way to the edge of the true sentence and couldn't say it. I grieved her too, and then I let her go, the same as the rest. At 7 months pregnant, I got one more letter from my mother. I knew it was from her before I opened it, because of the handwriting on the envelope. But this handwriting was different. Shaky. Some words were darker than others, like she'd pressed too hard. I opened it sitting on the couch with my feet up, the baby pressing against my ribs. The blue blanket folded over the arm of the chair beside me. The letter was short, just 1 page. My mother wrote that she missed me. She wrote that she wished things were different. She wrote that she didn't know how to fix this without betraying Roland. She wrote that she hoped I was healthy, and that the baby was healthy. She wrote that she thought about me every day. The sentences trailed off in places like she'd lost her train of thought. There was no mention of the wedding. No acknowledgement of what she'd done, just honest admission that she was choosing Roland over me and couldn't figure out how to do anything else. I read the letter 3 times. The honesty was almost worse than the manipulation. At least manipulation meant she was trying to get something. This was just resignation. This was her saying she knew she was wrong. But she was going to keep being wrong anyway, because the alternative meant disappointing the man she'd built her whole second life around protecting. I sat there with the page in my lap, and I let myself just for a minute. Imagine the other version. The version where the letter said the real thing, where she wrote that she'd been a coward, that she'd let a controlling man stand between her and her own child, that she'd watched my father's pictures come down off the walls and said nothing, that she'd practiced an aisle walk for someone else's daughter and couldn't be bothered to offer one to me, and that she was sorry plainly, without conditions, without Roland's voice anywhere in the sentences. If that letter had come, I'd have driven to her house that same afternoon. I knew that about myself. The door had never actually been locked from my side. It had only ever been locked from hers. But that letter wasn't going to come, and I knew that too. And the knowing was a grief with no drama left in it, just a quiet settling like snow. I filed the letter in a folder with all the others. Then I went back to folding tiny baby clothes and preparing for my son's arrival. Elias came home and asked if I was okay. I said I was. He asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said no. Not because I was hiding from it, but because there was nothing left underneath it to dig up. I'd dug it all up already. Over months in conversations on balconies and kitchen tables and the floor of a half-empty apartment, and I'd reached the bottom. And the bottom was just this: a mother who loved me less than she feared a man. A fact, finally, instead of a question. He kissed my forehead and started making dinner. I watched him move around our kitchen. This man who'd kept a list of every time someone had been unkind to me so that I'd never have to wonder whether I'd imagined it. And I felt grateful for the family I'd built, the one that chose me back. In the last weeks before the birth, the apartment filled up with the evidence of all of it. The sage green nursery Elias's mother had helped me paint. The crib his father had assembled twice because he wasn't satisfied with the first attempt. The album of my father's photographs on the shelf, where my son would be able to find it when he was old enough to ask questions. The blue blanket washed and waiting. The stack of books from Marin. The diapers from Nadia with her spreadsheet taped to the box as a joke. I'd walk through that room sometimes at night, one hand on my belly, and I'd think about the empty seat I'd spent my whole life staring at, and I'd understand that I wasn't building this child a life around an absence. I was building it around a presence around all these people who'd shown up, and the absence was just one chair at the edge of a very full room, and my son would never even notice it was there, because there would always be a lap free, an arm open, a voice saying his name like it was the best word they knew. Our son arrived 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning. Labor was long and hard, and Elias held my hand through all of it. When he finally came out, crying and perfect, the nurse placed him on my chest. Elias cut the cord with shaking hands. The hospital room filled with visitors within hours. Elias's parents came first. His mother cried holding our son. His father told him he was lucky to have such a strong mother. My aunt arrived with flowers and the blue blanket, which she'd insisted on carrying herself. My uncle Theodore came, the one Roland had tried to use as a phone, and he stood at the foot of the bed, wiping his eyes and saying he should have been around for all of it. Every year he'd missed, and I told him he was here for this, the one that counted. Nadia came straight from work, still in her scrubs. Marin showed up with a giant stuffed bear and tears streaming down her face, and she held my son and looked at me over the top of his head and didn't say a word because we were past the point of needing them. They all took turns holding my son and crying happy tears. Elias's mother asked what we were naming him. We said Owen after my father. My aunt made a sound I'd never heard her make and pressed the blue blanket to her face because Owen was her brother's name and now it would walk through the world again. She smiled and said that was perfect. I looked around the hospital room at all these people who had shown up, who had celebrated with me through the pregnancy, who had supported me through the family drama, who were here now to welcome my son into the world. My mother's absence was a permanent loss. I felt that. But it was also a gift of clarity. I'd built exactly the family I needed. People who understood what real family meant, people who showed up without conditions, people who loved without keeping score. Owen would grow up surrounded by that kind of love. He'd never wonder if he was less important than someone else's feelings. He'd never have to compete for his parents' attention. He'd know what it felt like to be chosen.